Next on AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show. Here's Brian O'Neill.
And always glad to have with us Alfred State History Professor Dr. Nick Waddy. Dr. Waddy, thank you so much for joining us.
It's an honor to be with you, Brian. Thanks for having me.
Well, Dr. Nick Waddy, let's start out with the audio sound bites. This is Rush Limbaugh talking about the attempted coup and against President Donald Trump. Those are Rush's words. And Rush says the reason that it all happened was because they just did not like Donald Trump's personality type.
Simply because Donald Trump was unacceptable to them. Not because Donald Trump posed a threat to America, folks. Donald Trump has never posed a threat to America. In fact, Donald Trump wants to make America great again in ways these people do not ever want to see again. They don't want to see America first. They want to see themselves first.
What do you make of that slam there?
Well, I certainly agree that it was a coup. I mean, it certainly seems that way to me. Of course, I think the great question here has always been, did the people who began this Trump-Russia hoax believe it in the first place? Did they concoct it to essentially frame President Trump, or did they actually believe that he could be a Russian agent? And really the only way to get to the bottom of that is a full investigation. And as I've said before, I think the only way to do that is perhaps with a second special counsel. So in that sense, I agree with Rush.
And here's what President Trump said on the Sean Hannity show about the character of those who came after him.
What's gone on there is just a disgrace to our country.
Mr. President.
But a lot of innocent people were hurt very badly, and it's very, very sad, actually.
And President Trump there, referring to the whole list, the whole who's who, Mike Flynn, and all those who ended up arrested and charged on charges that had nothing to do with Russian collusion.
Yeah, I think he's right. A lot of people's lives were ruined. If you look at someone like Paul Manafort is certainly no angel, but he was placed in solitary confinement. He's might well end up spending the rest of his life in prison, essentially because he cheated on his taxes. And, you know, normally that's a crime that receives a fine.
And Manafort is doing some serious time there for the offense.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, this is the story of the Mueller investigation, that they tried to get President Trump to the best of their ability. And, you know, they got a bunch of small fish on completely unrelated charges. But the Mueller investigation was a failure. And Democrats, I think, are coming to grips with that. Again, they're teasing out of the report anything that they can to support the idea that this hasn't been a witch hunt, that Donald Trump wasn't framed, that there wasn't a coup. But we still need to get to the bottom of that. And I hope that Bill Barr is the man to do it.
What do you make of the Democrats, of some of the Democrats anyway, wanting to go after Trump's business and see all the taxes for all his businesses? I mean, where does this end?
Well, that's a good question. And I think we saw this week that Trump's lawyers have fired back, challenging those subpoenas, essentially arguing that Congress is on a fishing expedition. And if I could just go back to what Rush said, I think, you know, this is personal. And in fact, that's the last thing that I posted on the blog was an interesting article. I saw this title, and I just had to read the article. It wasn't a very good article, but the title was, let's see if I can find it here, Donald Trump's personality is an impeachable offense. And I think maybe the person who wrote this article, it was a little tongue-in-cheek, but I think that's what it comes down to with Donald Trump and the left. They hate him personally, and you know, all the legal machinations, all the suggestion that he's violated the Constitution, none of that really matters to them. They don't really care what they get him on. They just want to get him because he is personally loathsome to them. And so they're going to keep after him until they either succeed or, well, I suppose, assuming he's reelected in 2020, as I believe he will be, I imagine they'll continue the assault after that.
Why do you think he's going to get reelected? What makes you think so?
Well, for a lot of reasons, but I think if you look at the field of Democratic candidates ranged against Trump, frankly, from my perspective, none of them are truly scary. None of them are truly formidable. They all have serious weaknesses. And I think Trump has a lot of successes that he can run on with the economy and foreign relations. He's at least trying to tackle the crisis at the border. And Democrats are embracing so many far left positions, from socialism to Medicare for all, to essentially open borders. And they're engaged in such a nakedly opportunistic vendetta against the president that I think they're going to have some serious weaknesses and some serious internal division. So, I think President Trump has a very good chance at being reelected.
Do you, I don't know how much you catch the Tucker Carlson show on the Fox News channel there, Dr. Waddy. One of Tucker Carlson's running themes is that the Democrats are increasing the amount of illegal immigration rates, that they're bringing more and more in as a way to punish the voters who abandoned the Democratic Party and voted for Trump. It's a way to say, hey, you didn't do what we wanted you to, you being the voters. We're going to bring in new voters and they'll vote for us. What do you make of that theory?
Well, none of the people who are coming across the border are going to be voting anytime soon, but I do think the Democrats, and a lot of them are quite honest about this, they are looking forward to a demographic transformation of the country, and they will, if you're a Republican, they will tell you over and over that your goose is cooked. It's just a matter of waiting until enough older Republican voters die and enough younger Democratic voters come onto the rolls, and the Republican Party will be destroyed. And they seem to truly believe this, that they can win a demographic victory over the Republican Party. I don't think it's true, but the Democrats are creating the conditions for this wave coming across the border to continue and to increase in size. They apparently cannot bring themselves to deport anyone, and they apparently believe any claim of asylum, regardless of how specious it is. So they are certainly abetting this movement of people from Central America to the United States, but they're not responsible for it.
One name that keeps coming up is the mayor out there in Indiana, Mayor Pete. I see a lot of people on Facebook that I know locally seem to like the guy. What do you think his chances are for 2020?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm a political junkie, and I'm very, very interested in the Democratic race for president. They've now got 20 candidates. That's, mind-blowing. But Mayor Pete, there's started to be some articles written on the left about him that are very critical, and a lot of them have focused on the fact that he's a white male candidate. He doesn't necessarily have a lot of minority support. He hasn't always had the best relations with minorities in his own city of South Bend, Indiana. So, I think what we're going to see for the next year, maybe longer, is the Democrats are going to eat their own. They're going to form a circular firing squad, and they're going to do great damage to each other. And, there were two national Democratic polls out today. Both of them put Biden ahead, Sanders nipping at his heels, and Mayor Pete is, he may be in third place now, but he's the flavor of the month, so I don't think that means a great deal. So I would assess his chances as fairly low.
And it seems like Beto is out of the picture, though, because of Mayor Pete. What do you make of that, Nick Waddy?
Yeah, that's very interesting. He was the darling of the left when he was running for Senate, and seems to be losing steam at this point. As I've said before, I think Biden has the advantage. Sanders seems to have a lot of staying power. He's got an impressive amount of support, and a lot of people on the left are seemingly very loyal to Sanders. I think this race comes down to how strong a candidate Biden is. Unless Biden shoots himself in the foot, unless he really screws it up, I think Biden will be the candidate. If Biden implodes, if Biden goes away, then I think you have a wide open race, and any of the people that we've mentioned could potentially be the Democratic nominee.
Talking to Dr. Nick Waddy, going to take a quick break. We'll come back. We'll talk a little bit more current events, and we'll get into this day in history. Stay with us.
Finding great candidates to hire can be like, well, trying to find a needle in a haystack, but not with ZipRecruiter. Its powerful technology actively finds and invites qualified candidates to apply to your job. That's why 4 out of 5 employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate through the site within the first day. So while other companies might deliver a lot of hay, ZipRecruiter finds you the needle in the haystack.
Try ZipRecruiter now for free by going to ZipRecruiter.com/search. That's ZipRecruiter.com/search.
Checking in with meteorologist Gary Best. Gary, this call may be monitored for quality control purposes.
Okay, I'll be on my best behavior then, I guess.
What do we got weather-wise, Gary?
Well, I got some pretty nice weather coming up here during today, even though it's cloudy right now. This morning sunrise was at 6:16 a.m., and it'll set later this evening, I should say, at 8:03 p.m. And we're going to see some sunshine developing during today, a mix of cloud and sun, breezy about 55 to 60 during this afternoon. Gets a bit chilly tonight, though, down between 35 and 40 and clear. Then it warms up, 65 to 70 on Thursday. Morning sunshine, then increasing afternoon clouds. So we're dry through Thursday afternoon. We do see some showers move in Thursday night, 45 to 50 then. Cloudy with showers likely on Friday. High temperature a bit cooler, near 60.
Back with Dr. Nick Waddy, the Alfred State History Professor here on the Newsmaker show. And Dr. Waddy, I do a lot of Google searches on topics, preparing for shows. One website that sometimes comes up is MediaMatters.org. I'm sure that almost all our listeners are familiar with Media Matters. It's a Soros website where conservative media outlets and conservative media commentators are heavily criticized. One thing I find on Media Matters website is they'll put up statements criticizing something that a conservative said, and very often the conservatives will agree. So it shows with the statement that Media Matters thinks is so outrageous and puts in their headline. So it shows just how divided the country is in their political views. For example, here's something you said earlier that a lot of conservatives have said that Media Matters finds outrageous. Here's the headline. Fox guest likens possible impeachment of Trump to a soft coup. Fox News host criticizes Bernie Sanders for saying incarcerated people should be able to vote. And the Fox host said that Bernie Sanders needs a civics lesson. It goes on and on with things that some on the left find to be absolutely outrageous that many conservatives would agree with. What do you make of that, Dr. Waddy?
Well, it's a great tactic. I mean, in politics, you're always trying to make your opponent seem extreme and out of touch. And, both parties do this. Both of them are pretty good at it. A lot of negative ads concentrate on statements that someone has made that are supposedly insensitive or outrageous. And, we're all human. We all say things from time to time that can be seen as offensive or actually are offensive. Sometimes we make mistakes, but that's politics for you. But, the left, the great thing they have going for them is they do control and dominate the mainstream media. So what that means is when a Republican says something outrageous, you can bet it'll be national news. But when people on the left say something outrageous, and they do it all the time, trust me, it's generally swept under the rug. So it's all a question of perception. You can find nuts. You can find people saying intemperate, wild things on both sides. The question is, who do you pay attention to?
We've talked about this before, but I did want to mention it again. Ann Coulter's kind of lost her place in the news talk world and in the commentary world. She's admitted this. She said that her criticisms of Trump for not being strict enough on the border have cost her a lot of people in her conservative audience. And the left never liked her to start with.
Well, the left does rather like her when she criticizes Trump, and that's the irony. I mean, the greatest way for a conservative to become national news and to get noticed is to criticize President Trump, because the mainstream media will pick that up instantly. Look at George Conway. This is the way the game is played, and there's a certain amount of silliness to it. As I said, you can find outrageousness all over the political map, but that's politics.
Before we move on to this day in history, I did want to ask you, now you were a fan of George W. Bush when Bush was in office. I'm not sure how you feel about him since George W. has become a big Trump critic. What do you make of the whole George P. Bush? I think the P stands for Prescott. That would be George H.W. Bush's father. TheHill.com and other Washington news websites talk about him as possibly being the next Bush in politics. What do you make of it?
Well, my feelings about W are mixed. I was a big fan of George W. Bush when he was running for president in 2000. I followed, like the rest of the nation, the recount controversy in Florida. I was extremely happy when he became president. But I think, like a lot of Republicans who are more, shall we say, nationalistic in their orientation, I was pretty disappointed that his presidency sort of got hijacked by these wars in Afghanistan and Iraq in particular. I didn't think invading Iraq was a good idea from the beginning, and unfortunately that sort of came to define his presidency. As to the future of the Bush family, I think it's difficult to speculate. I mean, at this point in time, Trump dominates the Republican Party so much that whether there's room for a Bush is questionable. But I think that part of the Bush family is at least partly Hispanic, and that's certainly an asset in the state of Texas. So I think he could go far in Texas, and who knows? I'd like to think that Trump will be reelected in 2020, and maybe after Trump we'll have President Pence, and maybe after President Pence, maybe Barron Trump could be president. So I'm just not sure there's room for a Bush.
Dr. Waddy, this day in history, 1953, Winston Churchill becomes Sir Winston Churchill. He was knighted by the British Empire, April 24th, 1953.
Yeah, Winston Churchill was, I think, by most accounts, the man of the 20th century. He was at the center of the First World War. He was at the center of the Second World War. And he was instrumental in the Cold War, and those are all the major events of the 20th century. I'm not a person who's inclined to hero worship myself, and I think Winston Churchill had flaws, and I think he made some bad decisions. But nonetheless, I would recognize that he was one of the great men of the 20th century and one of the great men of history.
This day in history, 1945, April 24th, 1945, President Harry Truman is briefed on the Manhattan Project. That's that was developing the bomb. What do you make of Truman and that topic?
Mm-hmm. Well, this is a topic that we discuss every semester in my classes because it's very interesting. But I also happen to believe quite strongly that first of all, I don't think it was a very difficult decision for President Truman to drop the bombs on Japan, because we were already bombing German and Japanese cities to rubble and to cinders with conventional and incendiary bombs. So this was just more bang for your buck, if you will, and I don't think people were very concerned about the moral quandaries in 1945. But there's no question that nuclear weapons change the world, and I'm a believer in the theory of essentially mutually assured destruction, meaning that nuclear nuclear weapons, because of their awful destructive power, essentially freeze the current strategic situation and prevent major powers from going to war with each other. We've had a relatively peaceful era in human history since 1945. It might not always seem that way, but it's true. Wars have been relatively small. And compared to the destruction of the first half of the 20th century, we've gotten off easy, and nuclear weapons have a lot to do with that. So in a perverse way, I think we should all be thankful that we have nuclear weapons.
1967, on April 24th, 1967, General Westmoreland addressed the issue of Vietnam War critics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, basically what he said was that the people who were criticizing the Vietnam War in 1967, there weren't all that many of them, but he was saying they were essentially giving aid and comfort to the enemy. They were allowing the enemy to believe that although they couldn't win on the battlefield, and they couldn't, they could win a political victory by wearing down the American people and getting us to withdraw from Vietnam. And of course, that's eventually what happened. So he was absolutely right. He may have been saying something that rubbed some people the wrong way, and they were rather political remarks for a general to make. But it's true that the people who protested the Vietnam War, who were involved in the anti-war movement, who were involved in the peace movement, they have a right to their beliefs, certainly, but they were also playing into the hands of the Soviet Union and the communists in the Cold War. And the Soviet Union and the communists were well aware of that.
This day in history, April 24th, 1980, President Carter's failed Iran hostage rescue mission.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this was tragic because it prolonged the agony of the Americans who were hostages in Vietnam. And it may have been a pivotal event in human history in the sense that it added to the narrative of the weakness of President Jimmy Carter, and it therefore contributed to the election of Ronald Reagan as president in 1980. And that was a very consequential election, as you know, because it sort of set up the conditions for our victory in the Cold War. Had this rescue mission succeeded, I mean, obviously in the short term that would have been good for America and good for the hostages, but had it led to Jimmy Carter's reelection, we all have to wonder whether the outcome of the Cold War might have been different, whether the Cold War might still be going on today. That is a distinct possibility. So I think the events that happened in the Iranian desert in April 1980 were even more important than they seemed at the time.
Final question for you. If Reagan hadn't been elected in 1980, would we eventually have somewhere in the mid-'80s seen a Bob Dole presidency?
What a great question. I think Bob Dole was eventually the candidate in 1996. He was something of a sacrificial lamb, I think, in 1996. He wasn't expected to do well. Would he have been a strong contender in the 1980s? It's hard for me to say. It's just so hard to imagine the 1980s without Reagan. I suppose if Reagan had narrowly lost in 1980, frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if Reagan had run again, or perhaps George H.W. Bush, who would have been the losing vice presidential candidate in 1980 in that scenario. Maybe he would have run. So. I guess my answer would be the odds of a Bob Dole presidency were always rather low.
What kind of senator was he, by the way?
Well, he came from a completely different era. He was more of a moderate, and the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have evolved so much from the 1970s and 80s. There are so many questions that today are partisan, deeply, deeply partisan, that weren't so partisan in, say, the 1970s. So there really has been a bifurcation of American politics, and people have divided into these separate camps, not just politically, but culturally, and I think Bob Dole really precedes that era. So he would have had difficulty, just like the Bushes are having now, in adjusting to new political realities, I believe.
Okay, an extra PS to that final question. Saturday Night Live at the time Bob Dole was around mocked him a lot, and anybody from that period who grew up in that period, late 80s, early 90s, or mid 90s, would remember the impression of Bob Dole, where he keeps saying his own name, Bob Dole, Bob Dole, and that was the Saturday Night Live impression. Is SNL too influential politically? Meaning, are they really political commentators, or did they become so after the original cast of Bill Murray and those guys, who really, in some ways, were not, depending on which cast member you talk about? But did it become too political and too left?
Well, I mean, I guess the short answer would be yes. They're certainly too left from my perspective, but I would view them really as an extension of the mainstream media. The political culture, the media culture, the entertainment culture of this country is dominated by the left. And ridicule is a powerful weapon. And you can do great damage to someone's reputation and image by ridiculing them. And it's a very effective tactic. You know, if you look at how Saturday Night Live handled someone like Obama, there's so many ways in which they held back from criticizing and lampooning Obama, whereas Trump, I mean, it's the gloves come off. So, you know, that matters. It especially affects how young people view the two parties and major figures in those parties. So, I think it is problematic that SNL is so far left in its political orientation and is advancing an agenda. But, you know, it's a free country, so conservatives just have to fight back.
Which I think they do from shows like Rush Limbaugh. I think that Limbaugh and his impressionist Paul Shanklin pretty much single-handedly give it back to the left and the liberal media by mocking through imitations, the same as Saturday Night Live did.
Yeah, you're right. There is a broad conservative media that can push back. However, unfortunately, the mainstream media is called the mainstream media for a reason. It's mainstream. It's powerful. It's everywhere. You know, when you have 20 networks that hate Trump and one that likes him, unfortunately, the weight of those numbers is going to have an impact. And this is why Trump doesn't have a 70% approval rating, and presumably he never will.
Dr. Waddy, we've gone over our time. Always interesting talking with you. Always great having you on. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Brian. Have a wonderful week. Enjoy springtime.